now I'm going to segue back into presenter mode and introduce our second guest, or third guest, I guess, of the evening, which is Nick Thompson. And we're very lucky to have Nick here today to do another episode of our series, Beyond the Code. And I'm sure Nick will have some really interesting and useful insights for us. He has a 10-year plus career in software engineering, particularly in audio, and most recently is the author of Elementary Audio, which is a framework for writing high performance native audio apps within a JavaScript API. And I think what I'll first invite Nick to is tell us a bit about himself and beginnings in audio and software engineering.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Rachel. Beginnings in audio. Well, I guess my career kind of started in web development, actually. And I stayed in web for a while, moving from front-end stuff kind of onto back-end, REST services, that kind of thing, all the way into eventually like shipping like React Native mobile apps, front-end, back-end, full stack kind of solutions. It was 2016, I think, that I first decided I mean, before then I knew that I wanted to get into audio, but I wasn't quite sure how. And 2016 was around when I basically just started picking up textbooks and teaching myself DSP with the intention of like fully committing to the switch. So I switched into audio software around that time, and I started back then with a forum post on the Juice forum that became like a blog post and then eventually a talk at ADC about this kind of experience and this process of trying to just break into the audio software industry, coming from a different place and trying to do it as sort of an indie plugin developer. And it's kind of been a fun ride in audio software ever since.
And was it something, did you have a background in audio that made you want to make that move from more of a web background into audio? Were you a musician, or was there something else that inspired that?
Yeah, exactly. All through kind of like maybe even as far back as middle school, I was making music, playing with various DAWs and kind of teaching myself what I needed to know along the way to make the embarrassing music that I wanted to make. And yeah, kind of after a couple of years in software, I decided basically that I wanted to merge that part of my personality into my career.
Nice. And I imagine coming from a web background, you would have been working on maybe slightly different programming languages to what you would in an audio related job. Is that correct? Did you have to transition into different languages to make that move?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the first half of my career was very much JavaScript, HTML, CSS. But I had gotten into programming even like in, kind of around when I was 10 or 11. So even by the time I had gotten to that point of my career, I had experience with a bunch of different programming languages already. So I was working probably predominantly in those three at the beginning of my career, but I kind of moved into Python and Ruby and I don't know, all sorts of other things basically. So like React Native kind of took me into sort of the Swift and Objective-C realm at some point in my career. So by the time I got to audio, I already had touched a lot of different programming languages and environments. Picking up C++, which is what I did to kind of make my switch, was that was a bit of an effort, but I had also already taken some university courses in C++ by then. So I don't know, I'm kind of just a
Sounds like you took it all in your stride.
yeah, I don't know. I don't, I kind of love learning new programming languages. The language design element of it, I find pretty interesting. And there's so much that translates from language to language. So yeah, it's been fun.
And so coming from that background into audio, and your experience in the audio world, have you found that many people have that experience, like full stack experience or web experience, or that people are more focused, that software engineers are more focused on like audio, C++, and maybe a bit of Python if they're in research? Is that
Yeah.
a useful skill to have for people wanting to do audio development?
Python, you mean, or?
Your web background that you came
Got
from.
you. Got you. Got you. Yeah, well, I guess I'll answer kind of the first question, which is that definitely so far my experience has been that within the audio software space, people kind of just use C and C++. I mean, there's definitely, there's plenty of Python and plenty of MATLAB and tools like this on the research and DSP side. But as far as like implementing actual audio software that's going to go out to end users, I mean, C and C++ are by far the predominant language. Rust is starting to show up more and more, and this is totally also only my experience, so put an asterisk on all this. But yeah, I guess I would say, that has been sort of how it's appeared to me so far. But I kind of, I'm taking this bet basically that the web platform is not going anywhere anytime soon. And we're going to start to see more and more applications of audio software in the web environment, on the web platform, in your browser, et cetera. And so I think we're going to start to see plenty of applications where it's helpful to know both sort of low-level audio and kind of full stack web platform skill sets.
Okay. I asked for kind of like a slightly selfish reason because I'm working in a role at the moment, which is a C++ developer job.
Mm-hmm.
It's not actually in audio. It's in the aviation industry, but
Cool.
we have an Angular front end.
Mm-hmm.
So the C++ is the back end, of course, and then we'll have an Angular front end. So I'm going to be working between the back end and the front end. So
Cool.
I'm not in audio at the moment, but I'm trying to take what I can from that role and see if I can apply it.
Great.
So it's really useful to know that those kind of skills are sought after in terms of
Totally.
web audio.
Yeah. And I think it's relatively, web audio has been around for almost 10 years now, right? Maybe a little bit more. But I still think we're like on the, beginning of the upswing for more audio software moving onto the web platform. So I would bet that we will start to see more and more opportunities for, say like job opportunities that ask you to kind of understand both sides, web platform front ends and C++ audio DSP kind of things.
Excellent. It's really useful to know. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about your newest project, Elementary Audio?
Yeah, of course. I feel like we actually just laid a pretty good foundation for where Elementary comes from. So, I have kind of these two paths in my career, sort of down the front end full stack web developer axis, and then down the low level, audio DSP, C++ axis. And as I made the switch, generally, I would say that part of my experience was that the way that I was understanding sort of the industry best practice in audio software to tackle, writing an audio software application was so incredibly different from how the web world, the web platform world thinks about tackling and delivering a web application. And of course, like we're talking about very different environments, very different settings, right? Like you don't really have this situation in the web where you have to be delivering, real-time audio on a real-time thread, without blocking, without failing to deliver your buffer in time. So yeah, totally different environments, and you don't really see a lot of, say, like embedded work using web platform tech. Although I think that's starting to come around a bit more too. But as I was working in the low-level audio space with C++, it felt to me that some of the industry best practices were generally like causing a lot of problems and a lot of headaches that I felt had been already solved in the web platform world. And so I was working and feeling like generally I was spending a lot of time that I didn't have to be spending, because I could just take some of these solutions from the web platform world and bring them over into the audio world, and then I would save a lot of time. So that was kind of the foundational understanding for kicking off elementary. So given that background, what elementary really is an audio engine written in low-level C, C++, but that you interface to as an end user, as a developer, by writing JavaScript. So you might write, say, an Angular application, and in your Angular application, you might have some JavaScript dedicated to building an audio processing graph. And then elementary will take the work that you've done there and then go and get the audio engine to do what you've asked it to do. And so it will handle all of the native side for you and all of the real-time requirements and things like that. And given that separation of concerns, basically, I was able to apply a more functional programming paradigm onto the JavaScript layer, which definitely comes from my front-end experience working in things like React.js. So this is a totally different way to think about writing audio software, but for, given my experience on kind of these two areas of software, this to me is for sure a project that feels like it's accelerating mine and many of my clients' development speed, by sort of removing problems that they don't have to solve anymore, if that makes sense.
Sure. So just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, and for everyone listening, it's opening up audio processing capabilities for people that know JavaScript, without necessarily having to know like lower level audio processing, or languages like C++.
Yeah, it's a different framework for writing audio DSP. So you still have to know audio DSP. Like, for example, the presentation that you just gave on the fundamentals of, the trigonometric fundamentals that underlie a lot of audio DSP, like that's still super helpful to know whether you're writing your code in JavaScript with elementary or in C++ directly. It's just kind of elementary offers you a different way of expressing that. And it removes a lot of things that I think cost a lot of developer time, such as, paying attention to like no memory allocations on the real-time thread, things
Right.
like how do you communicate between the GUI and the real-time thread without blocking. I guess I could list a lot, but I'll stop there for the sake of brevity. It sort of takes away a lot of those problems. So you can just write the DSP piece and let the engine kind of handle the rest.
Sure. Josh, is there anything you'd like to ask Nick? I feel like I've been hogging the Q&A a bit.
Loads of things. So one question just on that. So one thing that one of my understandings is that with abstraction, of course, with any concept and any skill comes that you are giving up a level of control. And do you think that in doing this, that engineers that are used to doing engineering in C or C++, that they're missing out on some of the optimizations that they may be able to do, for instance, to get their DSP on a chip, things like that, will they still need to do that in C or C++?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So, one claim that I'm very much not trying to make is that elementary is the optimal way to write your audio software, period, right? Like, I think that there are a set of audio applications and a set of kind of products that we may want to deliver for which elementary is an excellent choice and will save you a lot of time and will deliver something that meets all of your performance requirements. But then there's a whole separate, world of resource constrained embedded chips, for example, or, I don't know, massively parallelized audio processing tasks that have, very complex kind of scatter gather rendering pipeline, things like this, right? Like, for certain audio applications, you need to be able to get down to that layer and do what you need to do. And, C and C++ are going to be around for a long time for handling these types of things. And so I don't want to make the claim that, people should just leave C and C++ and come to elementary, right? It so depends on what you're building and what your requirements and your goals are for what you're building. And so, yeah, I just think that there is a broad set of applications for which elementary makes a ton of sense and will save a lot of time. And that's where I'm focusing.
And with your experiment, with your discussions that you've been having with people that are interested in using elementary and clients, how do you see the landscape changing, or how do you see elementary being able to expand where audio is going and how people are going to be listening to audio or producing music in the future?
Yeah, well, so I guess I would double back to my bet that we're going to start seeing more and more audio software tech on the web platform. And so a couple of my early users of elementary have been doing, primarily audio software tasks in a browser. So a really interesting case is in-browser DAWs. I think we're going to start to see a lot more tools in this space. And in terms of correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of your question was how I see this reaching other developers as this shift in the platform starts to take place. One really exciting example that I'm personally excited by is I was working with a client who built an in-browser DAW with an audio software team who was kind of building the low-level audio engine stuff using elementary. But then we had this conversation with another of their developers who was able to look at the code that was written using elementary. And this person does not come from an audio software background, but they looked at the code we had written and saw something that they could understand and that they could grok and go in and update themselves with no audio background, which for me was a huge, I don't know, that's great signal to receive that we're kind of operating at a layer that people can kind of walk up to and understand what they're seeing a little bit more easily.
What do you feel are the advantages of, so you're talking about that you think we're going to see more in-browser DAWs and tools. What do you feel are the advantages of those? So a lot of people talk about collaboration, becoming easier when you're doing that in the browser. What would you say are some other advantages?
Yeah, collaboration is cool. For me, that's not the big one. Like a couple that come to a couple that I riff off here when I get this question come from my experience building and shipping audio plugins. I think it is so frustrating, the plugin install process. Like if I'm a music producer and I want to, install this cool plugin from some cool third-party developer that I found online, it's you kind of don't know what you're going to get. Like, are you going to just get a VST3 in a zip file? And then where do I put that? Or am I going to get an installer? And what happens if the installer doesn't run on my new M1, and what happens if the installer like puts files in a place that works for one DAW but not for another DAW. And there's just like a whole can of worms here that feels so outdated. And like, for example, an in-browser DAW experience could be like, imagine that I've connected my account with my credit card and I see that third-party plugin right there in the web browser, and I just say, yeah, I want that. And it's there in my DAW experience immediately, right? Because there's nothing to install, there's nothing to go fetch from somewhere else manually anyways. That one I think is a really exciting opportunity. Another one is, I think it's kind of crazy that like still, if I want to jam with a friend on a project, I can like say, make my Ableton Live project, right? Make my song or whatever, and then try to send the project file and all of the sample data over to my friend. But if the friend is like missing one of the VSTs that I use, they're gonna have a hard time opening that project, right? Like stuff like that. I also feel like that would be a problem that we could just so easily solve in the space of like an in-browser DAW.
You bring up a great point, because it almost brings up really, it brought to my mind interesting other models that could be possible, where maybe you borrow time or lend or just some type of auditioning feature that, or limited functionality feature that you have with that particular plugin.
Totally.
If it's in a browser, that you could just have in the interactivity. This works there. It almost becomes like, makes me feel like Spotify, but it makes me think about how we listen to music,
Yeah,
10,
totally.
15 years ago, where we were downloading MP3s and using them natively and playing them natively
right
on our machine.
That's a good analogy. I like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, but don't you trade one problem for another? So you have the installer. So you have the installer problem, but now you're trading it for a browser problem, because now they have to work on a supported browser. Am I right or wrong in saying that?
Yeah, sure. Like I can say from experience that web audio, so generally like the state of the art right now, if you want to make sound in a browser, you'll use web audio. I mean, more complicated audio processing tasks like an in-browser DAW, you'll use web audio because that is the feature available to you in the browser for custom audio rendering. And web audio has sort of it's supported differently in different browsers. There's some gotchas in Firefox versus in Safari versus in whatever, right? And it still feels sometimes like web audio itself is a little bit new. Like there's a lot that needs to happen there to make this like a fully fledged platform. But I would say so far, and again, like this is for a certain set of audio processing tasks. Like I'm not going to make the case that you could rebuild Ableton Live and every third-party plugin inside of the browser right now today. I just don't think that the web audio platform is there yet necessarily.
What do you feel are the limitations? What do you feel are the biggest limitations from having a DAW like Ableton Live in the browser?
Well, so like, Elementary, for example, the audio engine compiles to WASM and runs in WASM inside of web audio. But inside of WASM, like WASM is a super new technology. Web audio is a relatively new technology, right? Like I don't have a lot of control in terms of, at least insofar as I know right now, and maybe there's some changes to WASM that I'm not up on lately, but I don't have the same sort of like platform intrinsics. SIMD, for example, I think is still in the proposal stage for WASM, right? So some of the tools that are like crazy processor intensive that we use in Ableton Live today would be pretty hard to port to web audio today. In the next 10 years, yeah, I think we're going to start to see it. And so in terms of trading one problem for another, yeah, sure, we are like, that is something like we are talking about that, right? It's a different set of problems. And in my experience so far, it is much easier to deal with kind of like cross browser inconsistencies than it is to deal with cross platform inconsistencies.
Right.
Just in terms of the work that you end up doing as a developer. But that, again, put a big asterisk on that, because I can only speak from my experience, and I've been doing this for a while, but I obviously have not seen everything there is to see. So
yeah. There was a question from one of our from our live chat from Monte, who asks, would elementary be great for prototyping, and is there a way to take the DSP and translate it back into C or C++ code?
Yeah, that's kind of one of my theses, I guess, about elementary, which is that the way that we prototype, I would argue, could and should be the same way that we ship, right? Like for example, I think that we see a lot in the audio software industry right now. We see a lot of prototyping in something like Maximus P or Pure Data or Python. And then when it's time to ship the product, we hand that prototype over to a C++ developer to kind of rewrite it from scratch in C++, right? As a Juice plugin or as a whatever on your embedded chip. And to me, that's doing so much extra work. And so one of my goals with elementary is that by the time you finish your prototype, you have something that you can actually ship. And so in the case of a web browser, for example, that's actually really easy, because you just take the kind of WASM backend that runs in web audio, you take the JavaScript you've written and you put it on your website, and deliver it to an end user. In the case of, say, an audio plugin, the elementary engine embeds natively, just compiles natively into, say, a Juice plugin. And then all you need is something to run your JavaScript to kind of command and direct the audio engine. So there's plenty of things you could do for like pulling that into an audio plugin. Kind of the easiest is run a web view, because then you can also use front-end web technology to build the user interface of your plugin. And this is currently what you get if you use the elementary plugin development kit, which is available right now with elementary. And pretty soon I'm rolling out an export tool, which will basically take your JavaScript and bundle it up and spit out a VST3 and a AU for you, so that you can ship plugins that way.
And speaking of the user interface, can you tell us a little bit more about that? So you said you have so with this SDK, do you have widgets that you're already made that people can customize, something similar to the Juice look and feel class, or do you feel that this needs to be done with a different paradigm?
That's not something that elementary offers directly, because a web view very literally opens up like a Safari instance basically inside of your plugin window. And so the way that you would write the user interface there is the same way you would write the user interface for a website. And so that could be with React.js, with Angular, with whatever. There's a million of these frameworks now. And each of those frameworks, there's kind of tons of different libraries that you could find for off-the-shelf controls with, look and feel, style, customization, right? There's like Twitter Bootstrap and Material UI and Tailwind CSS and all these things. And I just found a Daisy UI from someone in the elementary community, which has some things that look like knobs and sliders kind of pre-configured for you. So elementary is totally unopinionated about how you make your UI, but there are so many options in the world of front-end web development that you can pull something off the shelf and get running with pre-made widgets pretty quickly.
This is maybe a weird question, but one of the things that I thought was really nice about Juice is that despite the fact that people hate writing UIs with C++, Juice offers kind of an all-in-one bundled offering, right? So it's a bundled product where you say you could do all this with this one thing. Do you think that there are I don't want to say dangers, because I could see a lot of advantages and a lot of really interesting creativity in just saying write the UI and whatever you want. But do you feel that that's the way to go? That you say, well, here's how you write your audio code, but the UI, you can write it however you want.
Yeah.
I just wonder about that, especially for people who are maybe onboarding onto the platform, because maybe they're saying, hey, I just have no idea what to do here now.
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably what I would say.
Yeah, to be honest, this is something I've thought about in terms of sort of elementary getting its foothold in the community, right? In the community of people who want to make audio software, but have some interest in, JavaScript, or some skill with JavaScript, or some skill with front-end web development, et cetera. There's so many options in the front-end web world, right? Like, which framework do I use? Which widget library do I use, right? Like, even answering those two questions is like a serious amount of effort if you're new to the space. And so one of my, something I've wrestled a little bit in terms of where elementary, like what stance elementary should take is, do I optimize for, say, writing an elementary application with React.js with Tailwind CSS? Say this is like a all-in-one offering that I could optimize for, which would make it so then you would approach elementary, and I could say to you, this is how you should write your JavaScript, this is how you should write your UI, and if you just use this template, you can get up and running really quickly, right? I've thought about doing that. I so far have not done that, generally because there's also a lot of opinions and a lot of people who want to do things differently in the web space, right? So if I say to you, this is how you should do it, but you say to me, well, I've done some web programming, and like Rachel, for example, like what if Rachel comes in and says, well, I know how to use Angular. Can I use Angular with elementary? I right now my stance is like, yeah, of course you can use whatever you want to, but it might be easier if I said, you could use Angular, but I'm not really like focusing on that right now. You should use this off the shelf one, bundle that I've put together. There's a big trade-off there. That's a tough trade-off, I think, for a technology.
And when you make a choice like that, do you have to optimize for that choice, or do you have it where, or is there, does that have to be, how can I ask this? Does this have to be a choice that you have to make? So if you say, okay, I'm going to provide examples through React.js with Tailwind, that there are going to be certain design decisions that you're going to make there that are going to make it difficult for people to break out of that paradigm, or not?
I think, like, I'm tempted to say no, but the optimization that I'm talking about here in particular is optimizing for developer experience, right? Like, how smooth can I make the developer experience for somebody new to elementary and new to front-end web programming? And the answer, I think, is if I choose, say, elementary and React and Tailwind, and I just strictly optimize for that in terms of giving you a smooth out-of-the-box experience for making and shipping your app, then I think I could make that a pretty smooth experience. But I also think that kind of excludes a lot of people who have some experience and some opinions already about how they want to make their app, right? And generally,
couldn't you just say, well, if you want to write your app with Angular, then go down this path. This is information you need, and you can go your own. You can go your own way.
Yeah. Which is like, that's generally the stance that I am currently taking with elementary, right? If you want to write it with Angular, sure, go ahead. I personally don't have a ton of experience with Angular. Roughly, I think it would look something like X and Y and Z, and take it from there, Because
I imagine people with strong opinions would come probably with experience as well.
Sure.
To say, if you have somebody with a lot of Angular experience that says, hey, I want to write it in Angular, you maybe you could provide the endpoints and say,
Yeah.
well, here are here's how you access these parameters.
Totally.
Have at it.
Totally. And that is, that was sort of I think the way you just described it reflects the approach I've taken, which in some cases works totally well, right? Like I've had people come in with experience using frameworks that I've never even heard of, and they've made like really cool apps. And I can look at that and say, wow, I would not have been able to tell you, I wouldn't have been able to give you a great tutorial on how to pick this framework and put it with elementary, but you did it. That was awesome. I'm excited to see this. But then I've had other people come who are, somewhat new to front-end programming in general, somewhat new to elementary, who pick a framework that I'm not well versed in, but they want to start there, and that's totally cool. I want them to feel empowered to do that. But then if my examples and my support code does not give, if it's a little bit too open-ended for, say, that framework and that elementary pairing, then that newcomer could have a little bit of trouble there. And so there's all part of like the trade-off of curating the right developer experience. Do I want to say, no, don't use that framework, you should use this because I can curate a better developer experience for you? Or do I want to say, use whatever you want, I'll help as much as I can, but if you go somewhere I have never been, I'll only be able to help you so much. I don't know, interesting trade-off. I think it's definitely like how do you curate the right out-of-box experience for somebody new to elementary, but it's also how do you curate the right sort of community attitude for supporting people who want to do it the way they want to do it.
Absolutely.
It's interesting. It's like a fun set of problems to think through.
Definitely. Rachel, did you have some more stuff? I have loads more, but just want to make sure I'm not taking over.
No worries. I was just going to ask Nick whether he'd mind expanding on the terms declarative and functional, as these are in the main elevator pitch for elementary audio, and not everyone might be familiar with those terms.
Sure. Yeah. So, right. In my elevator pitch, elementary is very much a functional declarative way of writing audio software. And I think that contrasts with the sort of industry standard approach of writing more object-oriented audio software, procedural, imperative. Those are kind of on one side of the fence, and then on the other side, you have more of the functional declarative. So in the procedural, imperative, object-oriented world, there's essentially, you have to write your code both like what you're trying to do and line by line, like how it should get done, right? Step through every sample in the buffer, or step through every channel, step through every sample. And then for every sample, I'm going to do X and Y and Z, and I'm going to update my state over here, right? And then I'm going to keep looping. In the functional declarative world with elementary, it's much more a process that looks like, I want a sine, and I want that sine wave to go through a tan H wave shaper, and I want that tan H wave shaper to go through a filter. And I don't care like what you have to do to each channel and to each sample to get that done, like just go get that done for me. So the way that I like to think about declarative programming is very much dealing with the what that you want and leaving the how to the framework and to the engine. The functional element of this is, because I don't have to worry in elementary about how these things get done, I don't have to pay so much attention to some of the state that gets involved here, which is to say, like, if I want to run a sine wave, well, I have my like phase accumulator that's running under the hood that I multiply by 2 pi to produce a continuous running sine wave. And so there's this phase state somewhere in the engine. And if I have to manage that myself, then I am sort of, I'm placing the state management with the expression of what I want to happen. And as soon as you involve state like that, composing large graphs can become pretty tricky, right? In elementary, you don't have to pay attention to that. You can say, like, put a sine wave over here, deal with the state for me. And when you can express it in that way, you can build these pure functions that express audio processing tasks, right? A pure function being a function that you can call, and every time you call it with the same input, you get exactly the same output back. Which means that you can kind of build these components that are very simply functions and compose larger audio processing graphs just by composing these functions, nesting function calls, grouping function calls in various configurations. And at the end of the day, you arrive with a new pure function. And this is, you don't have to think about, there's so much like state and lifetime management and stuff that you don't have to think about in this case, working in this functional declarative model that you would have to pay attention to if you're working in the more, C, C++, object-oriented imperative model.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a very clear explanation. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat, if you don't mind
Yes,
going to them. So Monte asks, front end for elementary audio GUIs, would that be also straightforward HTML, CSS, or JavaScript as well, instead of frameworks like React?
Sure. Yeah, you could do it that way. Totally. This is part of, I think that goes to the conversation we we're just having about elementary generally being agnostic to how you make your UI. You can do it with whatever tools you're comfortable with, basically.
And we've got another question from Ethan asking, a lot of people who know JavaScript will love this. If you know C++, is there any reason to pursue elementary?
Yeah, definitely. I will say again, if you have a well-honed skill set in C and C++ and you prefer to do things that way, do your thing. I'm not going to tell you that one is inherently better than the other. At the end of the day, we're all trying to make interesting products and interesting audio processes. And, if you have a way that you feel super efficient in doing that, do it. Do I think it's worth exploring elementary if you are already skilled in C and C++? Yeah, if you're interested in it, totally. And the reason that I think it's worth exploring it is because this functional declarative model for expressing your audio processes and this world where you don't have to pay attention to memory management and lifetimes of your objects and where you put your state and how I communicate with the real-time thread in a safe way. All these things are things you don't have to pay attention to when you're working with elementary. They're problems that are solved by the engine and by the framework. And so I think it's, even if you're skilled in C and C++, I think it's an interesting experiment if you want to take the time to learn elementary, because it gives you a new, you're sort of starting at a new playing field for how you write your audio software. And you might find that saves you a lot of time. You might find that is something that feels more intuitive to you. And you might find that, it was a fun experiment, but you prefer C and C++, and that's also totally cool.
Yeah, it seems like there's really no harm in exploring different avenues of getting to the same end.
Totally.
In a creative way. Yeah, that's all the questions for now from the chat.
Yeah. There was somebody that was wondering just about the licensing model for elementary. Can you just tell us a little bit about that, how that works?
Yeah, totally. This is something that has kind of shifted a little bit as elementary is kind of getting its footing, both as a framework and as a business. So the current licensing model for elementary is generally it's free to use. There's a elementary SDK license that you can go and find on the website, which gives you permissions to use elementary to deliver your application. The way elementary is distributed is on NPM right now, primarily, which is a JavaScript package manager. And that will give you, the whole front end framework that you need to use to write elementary. And it will also give you the audio engine compiled to WASM for running in a browser, for running offline, for running the command line, et cetera. And all of these use cases, it's totally free to use elementary. And consult the license for the specifics, but definitely go and build. The there's also the elementary plugin renderer, which is a pre-built tool that you can use to make, to like run elementary inside of a plugin inside of your DAW. And using the plugin renderer is also totally free according to the license. Where the licensing, the like clause basically the license has is that an elementary will offer sort of paid add-ons. So for example, I'm about to roll out this tool which will take the code you've written using the plugin renderer and bundle it up and produce a ready to go VST3 AU, right? And so this will be a paid add-on tool basically where you purchase basically a one-time perpetual license to that thing, and then you've kind of like bolted it on to your elementary tool set. And so that's the licensing model that we're moving forward with. Basically, that's what you'll be seeing going forward.
Great.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
What are the next immediate things on the elementary roadmap?
Well, speaking of licensing, also something I have not rolled out yet, but I'm currently rolling it out basically to on private contract basis, on a private contract basis, is access to like the elementary core engine itself. And the core engine, it could be delivered as a dynamic library or a static library and linked in your application, WASM, or if you have the source code, you can just compile it straight into your binaries directly, right? And what's interesting about this is that when you have access to the low-level engine, you can plug in your own C++ utilities as you need. And so there's, I'm kind of still working on what this looks like as a public offering, but that's kind of the last piece of the licensing model. And so if for anybody listening, if you have a business need or something and you feel like that piece of elementary might be helpful for you getting your end goals, reach out to me. I'd be happy to chat about a kind of a private arrangement for now. And definitely in the near term, I'm aiming to figure out how this rolls out as a public offering. That's on the roadmap. The other thing on the roadmap right now is finishing up this exporting tool, which is more or less done. It's kind of in like the private beta phase. And then I've got a couple of fun DSP things that I want to make and ship. I've got a reverb that I've been working on for some time. I've got a new compression algorithm that I'm pretty excited about. So rolling out a couple little utilities like that.
That's awesome. Tell us a little bit about your community. So you have a really thriving community that have been building audio apps and plugins off of elementary. What have they been building?
Yeah, great question. And actually, that's maybe a great segue. I have some questions from the elementary audio community that I want to speak to while we have time here.
Sweet.
The community, honestly, so far has been so exciting for me. I mean, people have been coming into the elementary community left and right from all kinds of places and building stuff that sometimes even showing me how to build things that I had not yet thought about how to build. Like I remember one of the earliest examples, somebody came in and they shipped a frequency shifter using what was it, Hilbert transforms. This is a piece of DSP that I never really studied myself, and somebody just like wrote it in elementary and shared the code in the community. And the implementation was so simple and elegant the way they had done it, and it was so early in the life of the elementary project. And I found that a really exciting, that's like, to me, like that's a huge element of what the elementary community can be and is growing into. So that was pretty exciting. And it's really fun to see what people are building. There's a couple examples I think if you go to the elementary documentation site, there's an examples page, and there's a couple other examples from the community there that I linked to that were really awesome to see and really exciting to play with once they shipped. I'm going to try to find here the questions from the elementary community. Can I just roll into these real quick? Is that
Roll on
use
in.
of the time?
Roll
All right.
on in.
So I had a question today about kind of the best way and recommendations on how to structure an audio graph in elementary. So imagine that you're building an effect chain or compressors, EQs, distortions, etc. How you would structure that and how you would say lay out the presets. I would answer that by saying, if you go to the elementary website right now, I just rolled out this offering called the Marketplace, where I'll be sharing basically like little DSP utilities, one of which is a compressor. The code for the compressor is open source, and you can find a link to it on the elementary website. And this is probably the best example I can point to of real code for how I would suggest structuring an audio graph. So the spoken answer is generally, designing the audio utilities that you want as pure functions. So if you want a compressor, write that as a pure function that takes, say, attack and release and threshold and ratio, and returns a description of this audio process, right? Returns some composition of the elementary library utilities for affecting your compression. And do the same for your distortion module and your filter module, and et cetera, et cetera. And then what you get when you're done with that is a bunch of pure functions that you can then sort of layer in any way that you want to build a more aggregate, audio effect chain. And in terms of like how you might lay out, say, presets with something like that, you can also find in the example, in that example repository, the idea of a preset in this model is basically just a little JavaScript object representing, say, the attack, the release, the threshold, and the ratio, right? And so you can pluck those little pieces of state out and just use them to invoke your compressor function. And when something changes, say when somebody has moved a knob or something, or when you're loading a new preset, you're just loading ultimately like new values for these little pieces of state. And so you just have to invoke your function again with the new values you have. And so if you were to say compose an aggregate chain that has a compressor and an EQ and a reverb or whatever, then you would take your compressor values that you need, your EQ values that you need, and your reverb values that you need, and collect them all in one big JavaScript object. And that basically is your preset, right? So then the idea of saving and loading a preset is basically just saving that JavaScript object somewhere, maybe as a JSON string on disk or something, right? And then loading it back is just a matter of reading that state, collecting out the compressor bits, the reverb bits, the EQ bits, and invoking all the functions that you have again. I hope that was a sufficient answer for that question in the community channel. The other one that I got was best way to deal with plugin parameters in in React.js for a elementary front end. Again, I would point to that same compressor example. So state management is another thing that elementary is totally agnostic on. You can manage your state however you want to. The user in this question asked about using React's use state hook, which if you're not familiar with React, don't worry about it. But use state is totally a valid way to do it if that addresses the sort of needs for your state management. Personally, I've been using this really lightweight. It's kind of like an alternative to Redux. It's a project called Zustand, I think, which is basically literally just a event emitter that holds some, object properties. So the way that I've been managing my own state, as you'll see in that compressor example, is I just put my attack and my threshold and my whatever in this state store. And then when the state store changes, I get I subscribe to that change event. And when the change event comes through, I have, an updated set of parameters, and I just re-invoke the compressor function that I had written. And I pass the result to elementary's core.render. So there's a lot of ways to go here. I'm a big fan of simple, event-based store solutions like that. but Redux, useState, MobX, etc. They'll all work.
Sounds great.
I think that was it for the ones from the elementary community.
Okay. Just looking through the chat here, seeing if there are any other questions that work really well here. So Matt D asks, do you think a traditional web client such as Chrome would be received better or worse for user experience than an Electron app for JavaScript plus WASM, even though they're pretty similar?
Yeah, it depends on, kind of depends like along which axes you want to ask that question. So for example, in terms of like delivering a performant app, yeah, they're kind of the same thing. Electron is basically just bundling WebKit with a backend node process as a desktop app. So kind of like performance and feature availability, you're going to get very similar experiences whether you write something in Electron versus writing something as a website. So then I think the question to ask is, would the user experience of this particular application be better as a web app where I don't need to download and install anything, or as a desktop app where I do need to download and install, but maybe I benefit from having access to the local disk or something like that. I think those are kind of the questions where you'd make your decision.
Great. And JM asks, is mobile web audio different than desktop web audio? And does it need a different approach?
Nope, totally the same thing. The only like caveat there that I would put is that, here we start to hit kind of cross-browser web audio support things. So for example, my phone is a very old iPhone SE from, I think, 2015. And it's running a pretty old iOS. And the latest Safari for that iOS is not super hot with web audio. And so, some of my own applications that I've written don't run very well on my own phone. And that just starts to get into the sort of support offerings for web audio in different platforms, different browsers. But fundamentally, like the way that you would write your application is pretty much the same. And for anybody who's running a phone that's not from 2015, they'll probably be fine. You'll probably be fine to ship for them that phone using web audio.
So I guess one last question from me would be, once you've publicly released the plugin exporter, then are there any limitations in feature set in terms of what you would what you could produce with a plugin that you built in C++ versus one that you built in elementary audio? Are there certain things that an elementary audio plugin wouldn't really be able to do or do well that a C++ built plugin could do?
Totally. Yeah. So again, like, let's set aside things like having access to, handwritten SIMD things for processor intensive stuff. That one you're probably just going to do in C++, right? But then the more interesting question comes, I think, when this is another part of sort of like curating a developer experience question, which is such an interesting thing to try to get right. But generally, like the types of audio applications that you can make right now today using elementary are those which you can compose from the available elementary building blocks. So if you go look at the documentation, there's a reference for all of the things you can use. And it's a very Maximus P-like reference. You've got your add blocks and your subtract blocks and your multiplies and whatever, right? And utilities like a DC blocker and a direct transpose direct form to low pass filter, right? Things like this. And so the types of applications that you can make are those that you compose from these utilities. What you can't make right now is say, like, suppose that you have an algorithm for, a Moog ladder filter that you've tweaked yourself with some interesting, custom properties. that would be pretty hard, I think, to express using like the blocks available in elementary. So it'd be probably pretty hard to ship that type of thing using this kind of like curated export tool that I'm about to roll out. But this is where I think licensing the elementary runtime, the engine itself, becomes really interesting. Because if you have that C++ Moog ladder filter that you've written, you could kind of embed that into the engine as a utility that you could then interface to from JavaScript, and then do the rest in JavaScript, the rest as sort of a, elementary plugin. This is not a workflow that I am, that's not part of the export tool that I'm rolling out in the, in the next few weeks. That's more of a custom development solution and a privately license the engine type situation, but you could totally do it that way too.
Awesome. So let's see. Have you tried implementing elementary alongside the web MIDI API? And if so, is there any feedback regarding stability?
I have not personally, but let me see. I'm pretty sure this is in. I want to make sure I have this link in the documentation before I mention it. But for those of you in the elementary Discord community, BGINS, BGINS, Brian Ginsberg wrote something that does this. Is it here? Yes. Okay. So if you go to the elementary docs, the examples page, there's a really cool app, Coincidence Spectra. And this is an app made by one of the elementary community members. And this one does interface web MIDI with elementary. So again, I don't have direct experience doing this, but I have played with this app and it worked pretty well. So as far as stability goes there, insofar as I've experienced it, yeah, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to see these things come together, and it worked great.
Cool. All right. I think that's all of our questions. Yes, Nick, thank you very much. If people want to find out more about elementary, where would they go?
Elementary.audio.
Awesome. Simple as that.
And there's a link there on the website to join the elementary Discord. I'm also in the audio programmer Discord. I'm at Nick in there. Hit me up.
Cool. The original at Nick. Cool.
Yeah, guys, thank you so much for having me. I hope these answers were helpful.
Yeah,
it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much. And yeah, with that, we'll sign off.